Hey everyone, so today we have with us Dr. Kaveri Subrahmanyam. Dr. Kaveri is a developmental psychologist by training, and she has 30 years of experience studying the impact of digital media on youth. Currently, she serves as the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Florida, and she's authored Digital Youth, which is a book that delves into the role of media in development. Dr. Kaveri, we're so excited to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
I want to start with a little bit of history. So, throughout centuries, we've seen these various technologies take form. For instance, it was writing, printing press, then it was radio, television, internet, gaming, and AI. So, at each shift, we've seen some sort of pessimism in people when it comes to its effect on cognition. For instance, Socrates, at about 470 BC, he refused to write because he thought it was going to affect his memory. So, what's your opinion on this? How was he right, and in what ways was he not right?
It's a great question. And, when I was giving a lot of talks on the topic of, especially historical talks about media and development and technology and development, I actually have a slide that starts with the current technology and that goes all the way back to Socrates and what he said about words. The exact words escape me right now, but, basically the idea that words will compromise memories. And if you go back in time, think about the 1600s when the printing press came on. That was the same concern. And then fast forward in the last 100 years or so, you saw that with radio, you saw that with film, you saw that with television, then computer games, computers, internet, and then I'll say the iPhone and now Gen AI. So I think you're absolutely right. There's every technology that has been introduced has had this sort of duality, right? On the one hand, there's people who rush to adopt it. I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure even quite a few people had to have gravitated to writing, which is why it has lasted. There's always the early adopters, if you will, and then there are the naysayers. It's a complex question, I think. I think there's no question that whatever the technology you use, I think it does mediate how you think, how you act. And I use the word mediate carefully because it's very hard with causality to know what drives cause and what drives the action. For the first 25 years or so of this journey that I've had, I was always been very sanguine about technology. It seemed like, hey, for the most part, it fit in with what you were doing. I think the iPhone was a significant disruptor. I think you saw a lot of change there. I think that was the first time I suppose I was more in the moral panic camp. And then fast forward with Gen AI, I'm a little befuddled, right? I think there's so many ways that's going to impact how we think, how we speak, how we function. So back to your question about Socrates, was he right? Was he not right? I think there's no question that these tools have an impact. And I'll give you one simple example. Think about maps and how we navigate. So 30 years ago, when I grew up in India, where at least when I grew up, whatever, 35, 40 years ago, maps were not that common. In India, you largely use what's called landmark navigation.
Yeah.
You go from street and corners and whatnot, right? Buildings, and that's how you navigate. So coming to the US, having to deal with maps, this is pre-internet, pre-GPS, was challenging. I had to, and luckily I lived in Los Angeles. You had your north-south freeway and your east-west freeway. And it took me a few years of real study to figure out navigation and, learn map reading skills and whatnot. And then when the GPSs came, and again, you are much younger, so you probably may not even know about the Thomas's guides. It was this big fat map book that everybody carried in their car that had detailed maps, so that if you got lost, you could always pull over and figure out your directions. Now, fast forward GPS when it first came, and over time now in 20 years or so, I think map reading as a skill has probably declined because we just put in the address in the GPS and we just navigate. And even I do that sometimes when I go to new cities, and I always remind myself, you can run out of battery, the satellites can fail, you can have solar flares, anything can happen, right? And you could temporarily lose your bearings and your moorings. So it's important to have sort of a directional sense of the world where you're headed. And I think and today, if you did a study of children who are, say, 10 years old or 15 years old, I'm not sure to what extent kids these days or even young drivers know how to navigate using maps. So that is, I think, to that extent, Socrates may have been on to something, right? That it changes the way how you interact with the world, how you think about it. You have many other examples. You have calculators, you have computers, and but it's a hard one. At the end of the day, they're all tools. How you use the tool matters, right? You can
Yeah.
use a tool for good or not so good. That's, if you will, my sort of first stab at your question.
Has there been any studies that have shown us that if we lose skill in one area, does our brain compensate in the sense that we might get better at something else? Because it looks like we're losing skills and not really cognitive abilities.
It's a interesting question. I'm reminded of literature related to brain damage, right? Where people have brain damage in certain parts of their brain and they lose some skills. But then there's also the idea of plasticity of the brain, where other areas of the brain can take over. It used to be said that people who say don't have vision skills as well, their hearing is very well developed, where it sounds like one sense overcompensates the other senses. So I think that's one line of literature. And then I'm thinking about it developmentally, right? So when you think about brain development, we use the phrase use it or lose it. And much of brain development early on, there's what we call there's an abundance of synapses up until the first several years. And then as the child navigates his or her environment, learns particular skills, the synapses that are utilized for those skills are developed, and the ones less so are not so developed. One study that does come to mind, and I wouldn't be able to give you the author, but if you Googled it, your readers will be able to find it very easily. In the UK, several years ago, they did a study, a brain imaging study of taxi drivers. Now, back in the day in London, in order to get your black cab license, you had to have gone through extensive exams, right? Where you had to demonstrate your knowledge of maps and locations and neighborhoods in London. And so what they found was the hippocampus part of the region of those taxi drivers was much more developed. So I think there are lines of work that hint at what you are suggesting. The challenge with doing any such study is that oftentimes they become retrospective, right? And in psychology in particular, we care a lot about cause and effect. So I'm sure there's correlational data, which is kind of the data you and I were talking about earlier, where, right, with changes in IQ, declines in reading. All of that, unfortunately, is correlational. And it's really hard to say this is the cause or that is the cause, but I think the trends are informative.
Are there any statistical tools that we can employ to um, eliminate options when it comes to correlational studies?
Probably when you have really, this is why big data is so valuable, right? When you have large number of data points, you can have modeling that sort of, you can have models that have sort of causal links that way you can presuppose, I suppose, with some certainty that there are causal connections. But again, I think it's having the data, and the biggest challenge is having the data before the technology was introduced.
Yeah.
And then by the time it gets introduced, you have the early adopters, and then and the change of technology changes so rapid these days. Keeping up with it is the researcher's challenge or nightmare.
So you actually touched upon development and how specific ages are best are ideal for certain advancements. So that reminds me of Howard Gardner's thesis about how right interventions at the right time are crucial for the self-actualization of an
Mhm.
individual. Do you agree with his thesis?
Absolutely right. I think timing timing is everything, especially in development, and timing is especially important early in life. So just to give you an example, in language development, you have what we call a critical period or a sensitive period in the first decade of life. So between 0 to 6 or 7 is when you can learn a second language really quickly. And then between in 7 and 11, again, that's what we call critical sensitive period. Again, we can learn it much more easily. And then you have, again, 11 to teen. And then when you learn a language as an adult, no matter how proficient you are, how fluent you are, there are some elements, right, of your linguistic skill that you can never quite imitate a native speaker, accents, for instance. So when you speak to people and, their accent sometimes is revealing as to the age when they learned the language. Same thing when you think about cycling, swimming, skiing. All these skills are so much easier to learn early in life, whether it's, some of it is those brain synapses are getting formulated. Some of it, I think, could be psychological, right? When you're younger, you have less fear. As you get older, you have, fear becomes a factor that comes in play. But there's no question that there are developmentally appropriate times in terms of development and learning of a host of skills, whether it's motor skills, language skills, mathematics, all of that reading, writing, all of that, especially language. Language is the one thing where those early years are really important. So when you think about early intervention in the context of development and youth, it's absolutely important.
Why do you think language in particular stands out as opposed to other things? For instance, even I've read about most of these studies focusing on language as opposed to even math and sciences. What does it look
Mhm.
like, the critical period for math, science, or engineering skills?
I mean, so math and engineering is interesting, right? I haven't done a lot of core research on this, but in my role as an administrator and now dean, I do see some of the challenges with when you have students coming into college without necessarily foundational mathematical skills. Now, I think you're a physics major, correct? So you know how physics is dependent on math, right? Like,
Yeah.
in terms of say calculus. So, and when you and you learn calculus, calculus is dependent on algebra. So what happens is when students come in without not, having had a 2-year gap or a 3-year gap when they did math, then it becomes very difficult. It's not insurmountable though. With good teaching and good practice and diligence on the part of the learner, I do think it's more surmountable. I think it's because language is probably the part of our among our faculties, the one that is most closely rooted, tied with the brain and maturational regions of the brain. There are, again, I haven't kept up fully with the brain development and brain, which hemisphere deals with which. I think the left side of the brain is more closely related to language. But I do think just because of some of the early, what shall I say, milestones or findings with regard to language development, I think that's the one that is most closely linked to brain development and is sort of it happens. You do need the environment, right, for the support for it to
Yeah.
happen, but it just happens without a whole load of intervention. So let me give you an example. Every once in a while, you hear about horrific cases where very young children have been neglected or abused, right? And then you see what happens to their language skills or their motor skills. Again, in the developmental psychology literature, there are some classic examples. The one case is of Jeannie, the little girl who was found in Los Angeles, I think in the 70s. Really bad abuse. I think she was found 11 or 12. And then, even despite intensive therapy, her language skills never really matured beyond that of a 3-year-old. So you have some of these unfortunate natural experiments, if you will, that I think really speaks to the role of the brain and just maturation in developing these early skills. Another very interesting finding is that when babies start babbling around 6 to 7 months, they babble the sounds that are present in all of the world's languages. But by
Hmm.
about 9 or 10 months, their babbling is restricted to the sounds that they hear. So if you're learning Hindi, your babbling is more tuned with the sounds that that language uses. If you're listening to Japanese, that's the one that you are using. So it's like our brain is redundant, it's capable of learning as many languages, but then depending upon the environmental stimulation, there's fine tuning of that apparatus. So I think you have a couple different ways of knowing that I think language is special compared to almost anything else.
I see. In the case of the abused children and
Mhm.
them not being able to learn things as much, like for the case that you mentioned, do you think a larger cause of it could have been the fact that there was trauma involved and some abuse
Poss
involved, or was it the
it's
window that
poss
was missed?
it's it's an interesting question. Just to clarify, right? This was like one extreme case,
For
right? It's
yeah,
not like
yeah,
it's consistent finding that all. I'm not saying that any and every child going through abuse is going to have poor language. So just to clarify that, it's just really that one unfortunate extreme example. I think there's another kid of the wild kid of Aveyron or something. There's this from the 1800s or 1700s in France. So there's like a few examples in history and literature. I mean, you can never, that's the problem with natural experiments. You can never really rule out alternative hypotheses. That's why psychologists like the controlled experiments. So you can't really rule it out. But the fact that she did receive a lot of intensive therapy, but the language skills really didn't advance, I think is suggestive. Again, we also have a large amount of data about children learning a second language or even moving to the United States at different ages. And within a family, children come at different ages. And you can see that the oldest, all of them will speak English, but sometimes the oldest has a stronger accent relative to the youngest. And so I think there are these sorts of other lines of evidence that seem to suggest that there is something about those early years with language development.
That reminds me, currently there's a lot of emphasis on identifying talent in students early. For instance, if you identify talent in an individual, say before the age of 15, for instance, versus mid 20s or early 30s, is there a difference, at least in studies, if there have been any studies, in the peak potential that the person reaches?
I think the problem really is that, especially when it comes to math and English, virtually everybody is exposed to this early on in school, right? So it becomes difficult to separate. And I think the other complicating factor is interest. So, all children, for instance, are exposed to math in school, but some kids just love math. Some kids just love reading. So one of the challenges, right, even with technology is it that you are drawn to it because you're just good at it? Therefore, you're drawn to it. So you get more practice. And the more practice you get, the better you get. Therefore, the more you're drawn to it. So you have these sort of circular spiral hypotheses, if you will, that are very difficult to tease apart. But I think for math, for music, I think there's no question that earlier is better, and you probably hit some sort of a window at 18, 17. That doesn't is never say never, right? You always know the adult who's gifted at languages who can learn 5 languages as an adult. My
Mhm.
mother was one of those. People who learn swimming as adults and are pretty proficient. So I do think, and then the other complicating factor is not just early exposure, but the head start that they get in the years of experience and practice. So if you think about music, if you look at music, you look at art, you look at any of even athletics, right? The people who really get ahead, they have put in some incredible number of hours of practice. Without that practice, without that just I guess no, I can't think of a better word on the fly, but without just really practicing those skills on a daily basis. I mean, if you think of really proficient musicians, some of them have practiced 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day their entire childhood. So you have that early exposure, but then you have that extensive practice, and it's so difficult to separate the two.
I see.
But I do want to also say, right, we don't ever want to say that you don't have second chances, right? I think the beauty of development is the plasticity of the brain, the fact that you can discover something later in life and become quite good at it. So I think, again, that's the beauty of human life and human brain as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there have been some studies, and you yourself have done extensive work on this,
Mhm.
but there have been some studies about the use of passive screen time and its effect on cognition, for instance, in
Correct.
problem solving and language skills. Can you shed some light on why it's affecting problem solving? Because I get that why language could be impacted because
Mhm.
of, reduced interaction with adults, but what about problem solving?
I think all of that is, there's a question of exposure to the skills. So when you think about video games, right, and you think, let me flip the script a bit. Think about the study a long time ago that I did on the impact of playing a video game on spatial skills. We found a short-term effect, a beneficial effect. And one of the reasons was because you were developing, just for lack of a better word, those parts of your brain, those synapses that help with spatial skills. So I think by the same token, things that you practice a lot, that you spend time on, becomes the skills that you become better at. Now, problem solving, again, I'm not 100% sure which studies you're referring to, but
Mhm.
even television viewing, right? Some people, I remember back in the day when the TV people and the computer people would meet, and back in the day, you still thought about them as two lines of work. The TV people would get very upset when we talked about television viewing as passive, and to some extent, that is true, right? Because I think the brain has alpha waves and beta waves or something, and different waves are activated when you're doing different kinds of television viewing. But even television viewing requires a lot of skills. Just the other day, last weekend actually, we were watching a Hindi movie. The movie making skills were so difficult for me to follow because they would start at one time, then they would go to the past, then they would go to the current, and then they would go to the future. And I was like, I can't process this. This is too complicated for me. I'm too old for this genre of television. So I think even that we have to be a little careful, right? The effect is a little hard. So I think if you think about one of the theoretical frameworks I've given, we talk about time, right? It's time spent playing that particular or using that particular tool. That is also not just time spent with that tool, it's time taken away from other things. So you have to think that of that into account as well. So if you are watching a lot of television, maybe you're not using Legos to build puzzles. Maybe you're not doing jigsaw puzzles. It's what else are you not doing? And that's where it's a little complex,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's a concern that I've heard numerous times about how, unfortunately, access to on-demand video and media
Mm-hmm.
has led to a decline in other things that people do. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're not bored anymore, thus they're
Yes,
not developing other interests.
correct.
Um,
Yeah, I
but I
used to,
was,
I think that's one of the, when people talk to me about what are the negative effects of technology, I think one of that is not being bored anymore, having answers at the tip of your fingers.
yeah.
And, when I was growing up, we would do these long drives and just sit in the car and just watch the countryside. Seems like nobody does that, even, or you'd sit next to somebody and just have these random conversations. We don't do that. We're all staring at our screens.
In terms of the benefits, do you think that technology has enabled some critical, given us some critical advantages that without them we couldn't have had them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about the worlds we explore, the way we do commerce, the way we do our banking. Absolutely, it has opened. I mean, I think one of the reasons in Los Angeles traffic is so bad is that everybody just is willing to just put in the address on their GPS and head out, right? So I think travel, just exposure to different cultures, learning about different parts of the world, having, unlimited access to information, all of that has been fantastic. So I think there's so many. This is why I'm so worried about these technology and these discussions, because so much of it gets couched in the moral panic that, oh, it's so bad for us, it's making us isolated. And in fact, the early studies show, and I think that's probably true to some extent even now, it's the rich get richer model, right? There's a famous study by Bob Kraut and their colleagues. This was, gosh, maybe 1990s, where they did a controlled study where they compared families that got computers and internet introduced to their homes with those that didn't. It was like I said, remember, it's very difficult to get these controlled studies. One of those few studies that was able to do it at the right window. And what they found was the immediate short-term effects, but down the road, it made people a little more depressed and isolated. But what the fundamental idea about the fundamental point that I wanted to bring up was the rich get richer model. So what they found was people who had good offline connections, they leveraged technology to get even more benefits. People whose offline resources were not so strong, they seem to have been hurt more. So I think of technology as an amplifier, if you will. So I think for those that have the capability, the ability to use technology, the ability to exercise self-control, right, to be focused, I think that the potential is tremendous
Yeah.
uh, for them. But at the same time, just as it amplifies strengths, it can also amplify challenges and, in individuals', lives. And I think that's the challenge that we have now.
Do you think developmentally technology has added advantages to adolescence? Because adolescence is a time of high uncertainty and emotions. But the access to technology, do you think it has conferred any benefits that wouldn't have been possible without?
Such a difficult question, right? So I'll give you one example. In the adolescent developmental literature, we talk about autonomy and being independent. So be developing behavioral autonomy, emotional autonomy, values autonomy. Those are key developmental tasks. And certainly with the ubiquitous presence of technology in young people's lives, and to some extent, parents too using that, and it's the dynamic within the family. I think it has delayed, if you will, some of those independence and maturation tasks that historically were possible. I think in higher education, we are continually surprised by the parents who reach out on behalf of their children asking about X and Y, and we can't because we have FERPA laws that prohibit us from talking to the parent without the child's approval. Yeah, I mean, I think it has made, like I said again, right? It's the early years of the internet was there was some interesting finding that for gay youth, online spaces provided them the ability to meet people in other spaces who are not in their physical location. They were able to come out at earlier ages. So I think there's no question. I think for individuals who maybe have anxiety, social anxiety in face-to-face situations, I think helping, work being online has helped. So I think certainly there are benefits, but remember what I said about the amplifying. I think
Yeah.
when that becomes, and again, that hasn't changed. 10 years ago, I talked about the red flag being when online and offline lives were disconnected. I think that's true now too. So I think it is helpful as long as it fits in with the other aspects of your in-person offline lives. But when that becomes sole part of your life and it's disconnected from the reality, then I think that's a challenge. So it's really hard to say it's bad. I think it's good in some ways. It could be excellent in other ways, but it's also bad in some ways. And for some people. So I think the key really is who, what, and when. So for some individuals, it's been fantastic. For other individuals, maybe not so much.
In what sorts of individuals have you observed this dissociation from their offline lives, where their online presence is polar opposite of what they are in real
So
life?
we had a study where, social anxiety individuals are more anxious, seem to have more challenges. Another people who are sensation seeking have challenges. People with family relations that are not that positive or have problematic family relations, they are at more risk. So you really have this combination. It's the individual's personality, the parenting style, and then the access to the technology. So it's this like a big Venn diagram, right? You think
Yeah.
about everything, and then sometimes at those intersections
Yeah.
is where you have to really worry about. For the majority, is fine. Although I will say, I think no matter who you are, I think one challenge really is the ease of access of information and, just kind of time sucker, right? You have not, you're sitting in the airport, you're just swiping. So I found there was a time I would come back, no, I would be tired from work and I would just be on Facebook on my phone and just seeing those reels. It was kind of funny, but suddenly 30 minutes have gone, 45 minutes have gone. So
Yeah.
I got out of Facebook. So I think it's that and that cumulative effect, right? Like you spending 30 minutes of nothing every day, and you think about what it adds up to.
Yeah.
And then you think
That
about
is.
what not, right? What are you doing with the time? But what are you also not doing? Is it a phone call you're not making? Is it a face-to-face interaction you're not having? Is it a book you're not reading?
There's an interesting study and then an observation around the world that people are now reading less. And what's interesting about it is that it seems that it's not that people who have read historically are reading less, but fewer people are reading long form text less. So like
Uh-huh.
there's fewer people who are engaging in reading, which
Uh-huh.
leads me to ask you, how important would you say is long form reading in the current landscape, and what advantages does it confer?
I do think it's important because if you think about language development and you think about early language development and how the maternal input, family input, right, parental input to the child is so important, and how early narrative language, that is books and picture books, and then books which are longer form books, all of that is the narrative basis on which children's historically we have taught expository language, which is the kind of language we do in schools. So part of me says that it is important because how do you become, like, for instance, even though you've seen all vast amount of writing I've done in the last 5 to 10 years, I haven't been writing at that pace, like actual books and papers. Mostly I write emails, I'm meeting people, right? I'm doing different kinds of writing. It is really difficult for me to sit down and produce 500,000 words, even 1,000 words of text. And I grew up doing that. Hand wrote my first master's thesis in India and gave it to the typist who then typed it. I can't even write with my hand now. I can only write on the
Yeah.
keyboard. So certainly what you do impacts, but I do have to think that all that we know about language development, the amount of vocabulary is related to book reading. All of that suggests to me that reading long form is important. And I do think reading long form in paper version is important because I think I think there's I mean, we have just rushed to adopt digital books, textbooks. I just don't know whether they're really equivalent in terms of memory, right? In terms of comprehension, in terms of retention. Now, the elephant in the room, of course, is when were you exposed to technology? And I always wonder if you grew up with technology, maybe your brain is adapted to it in a way that someone like mine is not. Maybe it's harder for me to read digital text. Those are empirical questions. Like I said, very difficult to study at this point in slice of history, because even if we found a group of people in the United States who don't use technology, they're so different in other ways. It would be very difficult to say it's the lack of
Yeah.
exposure to technology. Is really difficult to pinpoint. But kind of to your question, I do think exposure at early time, back to your initial question, I think it is important. Being exposed to literature is important because reading is what gives you exposure to vocabulary, gives you exposure to different kinds of sentence structures. It teaches you about the different tools that writers have. Back when I was writing my book, if I had a block and I couldn't figure out how to present something, I would go and look at other people's writing, completely different topics to get inspiration. So it is really that exposure, that immersion in literature and language that I think gives you the foundational skills. Now, the reality also is that the workplace doesn't demand such long writing, right? Everything, the emphasis is on short, brief, visual infographics. So the world is changing. But I don't know the extent to which you can really get to the nitty-gritty of an issue unless you read. So, for instance, think about it when you have a health issue. Say someone's debating between different kinds of treatment, say for cancer, let's just say hypothetically. To go into the literature, you have to be able to read what's out there versus just listening to experts. Because one of the things you also see is that experts have their points of view. And even though they may be objective in their mind, people have different points of view. Even a simple thing like you take your car into one shop, one mechanic tells you to do one thing, and you take your car to another shop, and a different place will tell you to do something. People give you different pieces of advice, courses of action. How do you make that decision? Each of us as individuals have to be critical thinkers to be able to read information critically, engage with it, and come to conclusions, whether it's getting a mortgage, it's opening a bank account, getting a credit card, it's deciding on a course of treatment, etc., etc. In our daily life, we have to make these decisions. So being able to read dense text is still going to be important. And so I think that some of that does come from long form reading. So, and maybe I'm being a little old fashioned, but I do think that's important.
Do you think these long form texts have an impact on then critical thinking and comprehension as well?
I mean, I have to think yes, right? But again, it's so difficult to do control
That's true.
studies.
It's most, yeah.
It's
But
very,
what's your
without school, so much of the literature is tied to schooling, and schooling is so common everywhere. It's very difficult to know if what would happen if you didn't do that.
That's true. And I think what's more, the another shift we're seeing is with LLMs now, how we don't even have to read anymore. We can just summarize everything for us, which does have its benefit. Like you can gather information on a lot of different
Mhm.
topics, but if it's coming at the cost of these long form reading and analyzing text, then again, it's
And at this point in time, I'll have to say, right, in my own, in higher education, I think we've really got to grapple with it quickly and figure out how we incorporate LLMs and chat, all Gen AI into our
yeah,
pedagogy and also so that our students are prepared for the workforce. But at this point in time, you still read stories about how the LLMs just make up stuff, right? At the end of the day, the
yeah.
human is still important to be able to critically say this is good, this is not so good. So I think exposure to these technologies too early in life could be disruptive, but we may also not find out that until we have a generation of kids going through school,
Yeah.
learning with these skills, and then finding out what's the deficiency. Or
Maybe we should
or
start
maybe
collecting data.
I agree. So what are their assets? You just don't know.
Another thing that people have been talking about around the world is that now the newer generation of students, they're more easily distracted. They're having
Mhm.
problems focusing for long periods of time. Is that something you've observed in your practice as well?
You know what? I always say distractibility from technology, it's not just children or adolescents, it's also college students, it's also adults. As I go through meetings, as I observe people in conferences, outside in public, people have a hard time looking away from their phones. I forget how many years ago it was, a couple of years ago, they made a big mistake in the Oscars, I believe, where the wrong person was announced, and I said, I bet you that somebody was distracted by their phone. I don't know if that's true. So I think it's doesn't matter who you are. I think even if you grew up without technology, I think these cell phones and these digital devices have a real way of disrupting attention. And certainly, I think I had a student many years ago when we were talking. I used to talk about this with my students a lot when I was still, actively in the classroom. And one of my students said, "Oh, it's the 20-minute television." Uh, the television series, right? It's about 20 minutes. That's people's attention span. I would have to think it's even shorter these days. I mean, you know how Twitter at one point or X had 135 characters. So, absolutely, I think our attention spans are getting smaller. I think it's very hard though, right? We're also flooded with information and it's very easy. We don't know, is it that new information is pushing out old? Is it the overabundance of information? Is it that we're just expecting the next message, the next dopamine fix? I don't know. These are really interesting questions. And perhaps it's a live experiment happening as
Yeah.
we speak. I don't know. But I think,
Yeah.
what I always say is that the technology itself is not the problem. It's really the user. I think if you're mindful about where, when, how, then I think it can be a really powerful tool that enhances all of our lives. It doesn't have to be an attention sucker, right? It could be if we are mindful, okay, I'm in class now, I got to concentrate, I'm going to turn off my phone. I'm
Do you
going to
think?
sleep now. I need to not be looking at my phone, things like that.
Yeah, that's true. And that was certainly a habit that's hard to break because, again, it's just so addictive, this mindless activity.
Yeah.
Why do you think that our brains want that hit of dopamine so much? I mean, if we think about our ancestors, like
Hmm.
hunter-gatherers, how could it have benefited them, these short bursts of dopamine or these constant hits of dopamine that's making our brain so hackable?
You know, I'm really interested in human history, right? Currently, I think I forget who's writing the book, but I'm reading a book about the origins of fire and cooking, and
Oh,
how, what was the role of cooking in our ancestral history, and so thinking about it, right? I mean, if you think about that nomadic lifestyle and not knowing when you get your next food source, perhaps getting that, whatever that fruit or whatever that food thing is when you encounter it and not knowing when you're not going to get your next food item. Maybe that's why we are primed to like it. A colleague of mine would talk about it as intermittent reinforcement. And if you look at, I think, operant conditioning, there are different reinforcement schedules. The one that results in the most is the most successful in behavior change is the intermittent one, where you can't predict when you're going to get the reward.
yeah.
The dopamine fixes that you get from social media and cell phone messages is a lot like that. So I don't have an answer to you for your question, but I think it's an interesting one. It's probably has its roots in our evolutionary past. I think, that's why also we see this gravitation, if you will, towards these visual forms of communication. Because again, if you think about, evolutionary past, where almost every culture developed oral language, but written language, reading and writing is much less common. We did evolve sitting around the fire, talking to each other, sharing stories. So I think television is really harking back to those evolutionary roots, which is why I think it is so popular. Why I actually think reading is the symbolic activity, which is the harder activity. And for that brief 20, 30, 40, 50 years when before television and now the internet and streaming, that this might really be what we are more primed for, if you will.
Yeah, that's kind of what I feel about visual learning tools as well. The reason why they're so popular is because somehow it's more aligned with what we evolved to learn, but I'm
Yeah,
obviously not certain of that.
yeah.
Um,
I
because
wonder
certainly
about
reading
that. Yeah.
has its own benefits as well. It's not like one can replace the other.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and again, reading, and it's interesting because I'm found that I don't really like to get information auditorily. I really have to read
Same.
text.
Yeah.
I slept through college. I probably slept through PhD as well, and through lectures because I just can't concentrate. But then when my kids were in school and they had questions, I realized the only way I could answer their question was if I saw their question so I could actually focus. So I think we do have different ways of processing information, and different people have different strengths. And, I think reading for some people, it's still going to be the primary way they get their information. I will prefer reading any day over watching a video. I can't,
100%. 100%.
yeah.
Um, yes. So, do you think the fact that the way we absorb information with reading versus visually also impacts the way we solve problems in the future?
It has to impact us, right? I think about it. They always say picture is worth 1,000 words, right? I would say a dynamic video is probably worth 20,000 words. So I think I'm always pushing my folks to present information in visually appealing ways, because I think when you create a really appealing graphic with the right icons, you can just convey your information so much more quickly. The depth of information is not there that I think you get by reading long form research papers, books, novels, immersing yourself in fantasy worlds. You could do it in when you're watching a show, I suppose. Things, yeah, I mean, I think you get remember different things. There's a study that the details escape me about what people remember when they heard about some. Patricia Greenfield, I think, did this, I don't know, the 80s and the 90s. It was a study comparing people who got the information, I think, on radio versus reading it, and they remember different things. So different medium, I think different media forms, I think have different strengths, and I think people remember different things when they access information through different modes. So I think that's absolutely true. And to the extent that visual modes become more common, I do think the way we collectively function as a society might shift.
People who are at most risk of developing addiction to
Hmm.
the internet, do you think if internet were not there, they would have been addicted to something else, or was it the presence of internet that got them addicted in the first
It's a
place?
great question. I think some individuals do, maybe have a propensity for addiction. They could also maybe have higher levels of anxiety that drive it. So I think you're right. I think I do wonder about it. Again, it's very hard to know, right,
Yeah.
because very difficult to do these studies. It's possible because I have seen some. It's not a personality type, it's not a temperament type, but it's sort of a predilection, if you will. And I think there's some evidence that alcoholism and some other sort of might have a genetic component. It's something that could potentially run in families, right? It's part of attention and part of being distractible. So. I think, yeah, if it's not in the internet, could be something else. But it's hard to know. It could be that you're addicted to reading fantasy novels. But because fantasy novels cannot consume you 24/7 in a way current technology is, maybe it's not so good. So I'll just give you a funny sort of incident anecdote, if you will. When my daughter was very young, maybe 6, 7, and she still had started reading, right? She used to be reading all the time. She'd go to the store with the book. She's in her 30s now. And I remember telling my mom very proudly, like, oh, she loves reading and she's reading it all the time. Now, I guess my mom spoke from personal experience. She was a bit of a bookworm. And she's like, well, be careful. Too much of reading is also not good because it shuts you out from, real world, face-to-face interactions. So I think, yeah, I think you could still be addicted, but the question is, do those other forms, whatever sources of addiction, are they all consuming as gaming can be, as the social media can be? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I also think it's the way we perceive it. For instance, things like someone could be addicted to working, but it wouldn't be called addiction because it's
It's
like a
yeah,
good
yeah.
thing.
It's a good
So,
thing. And
yeah,
you can be addicted to exercise,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
People who run like 30 miles, sometimes when they hit 60, they then have multiple knee replacements and whatnot. Yeah, it is. But, even too much of a good thing can become a
yeah,
bad thing. I think
for
that's
sure.
that's the key here.
Have you also observed or is it a common occurrence that people have multiple addictions at once?
I have seen data suggesting there's comorbidity, right? Like if you're addicted to drugs, you're more likely to, like if you look at the problematic behavior literature, people who use internet excessively, they do engage or are likely to see sexual content online. They're more likely to engage in other high, risky behaviors. So there is that sensation seeking sort of personality. There could be anxiety driving it. There could be poor family relations. I think the causes could be different, but there is some data suggesting that they co-occur, that you do see these things happening together. And,
Okay.
this, again, one of the findings of my work, early literature work, was that individuals, who had problem behaviors online, they continue to have some challenges offline as well. So I think they do co-occur. So that's why it says that the internet could just provide a venue for the problem to flower. It provides a wonderful venue, unfortunately, but I don't know that it's the cause in that way. It's sort of the trigger, if you will.
Exactly. You've also talked about cue-induced cravings. Can you shed some more light on cue-induced cravings as it
Cravings.
relates to the internet?
Sure, I think it's the idea that cues, right? Anything that reminds you of something can trigger the craving for whatever it is that you're craving: alcohol, being on the computer, being on the internet. Now, cues are not a bad thing, right? Even memory is dependent on cues. For instance, when I was a student, right, when I was taking exam, I would sit there and look at a question, and in my mind I would look at the board, and that would sort of trigger a memory about the professor talking about whatever that concept was. So, there is a famous study about learning words. I don't know, again, I could dig it up, but I don't know it's a couple decades old. People were taught words on land and underwater, and then they were asked to remember the words on land and underwater, and they sort of, it was a 2 by 2 matrix, and what they found was memory was best when you learned the word and remembered the word in the same context. So in other words, there had to have been cues in the environment that triggered those memories. So cues in themselves are not a bad thing. The trouble is if you have cues that are associated with a problematic behavior, whether that's alcohol, whether that's talking to strangers, whether that's being addicted to porn, whether it's being addicted to social media, then those cues are going to trigger the need or the craving and then create those behaviors.
So neurologically, how do these cues work? Because, for instance, when I think about addiction, say just one
Mm.
case, someone's body is addicted to caffeine. They need more and more doses of caffeine down the line, just to get the same effect. Same thing with the internet. You get sort of this you
Yeah.
get
You need
desensitized
higher
to it.
doses. Yeah.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have these sensitivity to cues. So in my mind, are there different regions? I'm sure there are different regions of the brain that are being
Yeah.
involved in these processes, but could you shed some light on that?
So I would have to say I don't know. Again, I think there's a whole slew of people who do research on brain imaging and fMRIs, and I haven't really kept up with the literature and, addiction. But I have to think again. The one thing I do know is that the brain is a fascinating organ, where there's both super specific regions of the brains, where particular regions of the brain seem to be associated with certain functions. But at the same time, there's also plasticity, where if something is lost, other regions can take over. So if I had to guess, there has to be a neurological component. There has to be synapses that are being built. But again, remember, that's not a bad thing, right? When
Yeah.
you're studying, having those cues and having those synapses are a good thing because they help strengthen your memories, help retrieve those memories, and helps you remember them at different points in time.
As a student of psychology, when you were taking these exams, were you aware of all this? And is that why you
I
look at the
wish
board?
I was. I think I would have been an even better student. No, I wasn't. It's just, as I've gone in life thinking about these topics and, like for instance, I'm baffled by, for faculty expecting students to be able to write blue books when they have never written in blue books before. Because,
Yeah.
again, when you are, typing all your notes in class, I just don't see, because that digital context is what's giving you your cues. So yeah, no, I didn't know all this as when I was a
Yeah,
student.
I had a similar experience. For instance, when I was preparing for exams, if I just turned to a page that had that information, I'd know. Oh
Yeah,
yeah, I know what this page is
ex
talking about.
Exactly right. That's why I was telling you about paper books versus digital text, because the problem with digital textbooks is that the words don't have a space on the screen. When I was a student, I would remember, oh, this topic at this page. I had a photographic sort of visual memory, and I think you are like that too. So that's how I remembered stuff. Now, obviously, if someone didn't have that, they'd be, for them, this context could be fine. So I think the thing that we haven't talked about a lot is individual differences and how we process information, what kind of what kind of the processing styles we have, preferences we have, strengths we have. I think it all comes together in this new world that we live in. So it's fascinating topic, great questions.
So do you actually think that there are different kinds of learners? Do you agree with that thesis? Like some people learn better by listening versus
Yeah.
reading, visual? Okay.
Absolutely. I think I've definitely seen that in teaching, which is why when I taught, right, as a student, I always had to see the information. So for me, as a faculty member, I always taught, but I always had visuals on the board. I think it's both important. By the same token, I would find some students who were great when I asked discussion questions, really engaged in the classroom, but their tests and exams were not so great. So as a faculty, when I was still in the classroom, I always gave assessments that tapped into different kinds of skills so that people could demonstrate competency in different ways. Did I probably privilege exams more than papers? Probably. If I went back to the classroom, would I teach differently? Probably. So yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge, I think, for educators is you can't also cater to every individual style, right? That would make the job of the teacher impossible. So you kind of have to do what gets the majority of your learners.
Speaking to that effect, currently there's a huge interest in these AI-enabled education where, in the sense that people are trying to build these AI tutors. What's your take on that?
Sometimes I feel like I have deja vu, right? I go back to the time when computers first came and everybody was like, how about these software things? And, they're going to be, they're going to make teachers obsolete. I don't know, because I have to say that Gen AI, I have found makes in the hands of an expert is incredible, right? So when I have 15 emails to synthesize and I ask Copilot to do it, I am astounded by how good a job it does. There is no
Yeah.
question. But I'm an expert and I know what I'm looking for. And so I'm not worried, right? Yes, can I write as well anymore? I don't know. And you might have to put me in a deserted island without internet and say, right, now maybe I'll get back my writing skills, or maybe that's gone forever. So I think it has tremendous potential. I do think so. For instance, as a human tutor, right, explaining concepts to students over and over again, it could get very, very frustrating. But repetition is so important when you think about language development. For children who are struggling to learn, a computer or an AI tutor that can go over and over again at the same concept, tremendous benefit. But if and when students start taking these Gen I as shortcuts, and are not exercising those neural, synapses or those brain cells or whatever it is to develop those skills on their own. I don't know. I mean, I think I did physics in high school. Beyond that, I didn't do physics. I mean, if you didn't have basic concepts of algebra, could you be effective? I don't know.
No.
If you don't have those number sense intuitively, could you grapple with those difficult physics concepts? I don't know. So I do worry about that. If these tools become the only way you are able to engage with this concept or this topic, can you ever become an independent thinker? I don't know. That's my concern about these AI tutors. I
Yeah,
think
and
they
I
have
think
tremendous
there's
potential.
yeah, and I also think that there are so many different elements that are leading to the same direction. For instance, you spoke about independent thinking. I think us reading less also contributes to that. Like,
Yes.
so there's so many different ways, and all of this is interacting. It's just a very complex system.
It is, and I'll give you a completely unrelated example, polarization, right, from ideologies and political ideologies. If you, I think, look at, how polarized we've become, you'll probably see an increasing polarization in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, Because what's happening is people can go to the news source that most aligns with their views. They hear the message that they like, so they keep going back to it. And that's the only message that they see. And so they lose
Yeah.
the ability to critically go to different sites and unpack it. They automatically demonize the other side. So I think critical thinking, even for us, for adults, is at risk when we don't think for ourselves. At the end of the day, like I said, when you take out a credit card, you take out a mortgage, you have to decide on a course of treatment. Each of us have to make those decisions in our daily lives.
Now I want to talk a little bit about Flynn Effect. The reason why I, in fact, started exploring all of this. So, worldwide, in developed countries, there's been a pattern of either the IQ scores either stagnating or reversing. But it looks like this decrease in developed countries, specifically in, let's just say, Norway and the US, this decline is not uniform across the different subtests in an IQ test. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is that because it's not uniform, the researcher have sort of concluded that it's not the psychosomatic G that's decreasing, but domain specific skills that are going down in individuals. Do we have an understanding of what psychosomatic G even measures?
IQ is it's such an interesting concept, right? So I remember a long time ago when my son was young and he took an IQ test here in the US. I forget which one it was. And I think he missed a question related to back then they would show you pictures and you had to identify what was missing in the picture. So it was a picture of a piano keyboard, and you know how pianos have the white and black keys? And I think the picture had missing, the black portion was missing. The same IQ test also had a question where they had the rotary phone without the wire connecting the base to the handset. I think all the kids he missed the piano test, the piano question. I think he and a bunch of his friends missed the the telephone question. But to me, it made sense, right? Because we didn't, this is 20, 30 years ago, maybe, no, maybe 25 years ago. I was still, I hadn't acculturated to the US back then, still just come from India. And we certainly didn't have a piano in the house. So he had never seen a piano. I don't think he ever went for piano classes. So it was very clear to me that it was really the exposure that mattered. So I think what you're getting at is, yeah, I think at the end of the day, I don't know if there's something called a G, right? No matter what you do, how you assess it is dependent upon the context. It is contest. I don't know that you can ever find a culture free and culture fair test because everything is linked to what is valued in the culture. Having said that, I think the declines in IQ are probably, I think initially there was an increase because we were getting more exposed to visual media, and that's where the Flynn effect initially was documented, increases in performance IQ, right? Because we were looking at more visual based content. But I think the more recent declines are related to reading because verbal IQ, because people are reading less. So again, I think it gets to what is I think what you're seeing is that nexus between the individual, their skills, and their environment. And what are they exposed to? What are the sources of stimulation that they receive at home? Is it a lot of language? Is it music? Is it exposure to sports? And between that, there's that nature nurture interaction, and there's also then if you're good at something, you just do more of it. So I think,
Yeah,
I don't know how, probably there's a G, but how do you ever measure it if the measurement is so tied to the context?
exactly. And also, wouldn't the definition of G change with cultural and technological um,
Absolutely. So
interventions?
there's again, I apologize that I can never really point you to these studies where I remembered reading these things, but I think this was a researcher doing this work in Africa, and they were talking to, some Africans about they kept showing them the questions and they could keep saying it in a way that was deemed wrong. And finally the researcher asked them, like, what would a stupid person do? And they answered the question then the way the researchers wanted them to do.
Oh,
So yeah, it's so interesting because again, I think, the way what we value decides how we measure it and what is assessed. Now, there's another study again that is, I'm sure I can more easily find out. It was a study on math understanding in Brazil with street work. Again, it's 20, 30 years old, and the street in Brazil back then, the currencies were very big. right? Like, you could buy something for 1,000, whatever. So, if you bought five things from the street vendors, you were spending 25,000, whatever. So there were these street boys who could do all these fancy computations in transactions when it was related to money. But you put them in a classroom and you gave them the same thing, but in symbolic form, 20 times 25, they couldn't do it. They would not be able to do it. So,
Yeah.
so it's how you assess it too, right? It's contextually dependent. It depends upon what the questions are and what's valued in that culture. And to the extent that, we are moving towards homogenization across the world, I
Yeah.
think educated, well-off communities are more similar to each other. So maybe in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe we'd be able to get culture free and culture fair tests, but at this point in time, I just don't know if that's possible.
Yeah. In the Norwegian study, they started observing this decline about around 1993. And it was again in word similarities test and I think quantitative skills versus
Interesting.
the there was what the visual skills actually was sort of stable. But yeah, but that was the same line of reasoning that they used, that the word similarities test, for instance, the words were no longer in use, or
Yeah,
there was a decrease in use. So that's why
exactly.
they started to observe this decline.
Decline. Exactly.
But the fact that these findings are so consistent across developed countries is what I find most interesting.
Hmm.
That I'm sure word use and the pedagogical changes are not uniform across different countries, yet we continue to see study after study that these developed countries are either slowing down or stagnating. For instance, in the US, the decline that we saw in 2000 seems to have increased around 2010,
Yeah.
2012, which is much later than what we saw in Norway. And in the US, it was in mostly math, science, and verbal skills, versus 3D rotation skills sort of improved in scores. So again, do you think it was the technology acting as a protector in 3D skills with video games
Yeah.
and everything?
I mean, if you think about video games, right? If you go back to the video game study, I think my 1998 study, there might even be a picture of a map of a 3D world that my RA had created. And absolutely, I think these video games created these 3D worlds and we didn't even think about it, forces us to navigate in them. I mean, I remember doing what was the Dance Revolution, where you had the pad and you got the music and you saw it and you had to do it on and you had to rotate the skills.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's no question that with exploding TV and then internet, people probably are talking less within the home, they're reading less, receiving less high quality input, they're doing more media, they're doing more, video games. And it definitely, we have talked about how reading has decreased. I think, I think the other challenge really is that I think you're seeing lags. So the if you don't see the effects right away, but I think you see it 5, 10 years down the road. So that's what
Yeah.
makes it so difficult. So I think the challenges that we are facing in higher education, at some institutions where students are really struggling in high school, right? It seems like it's a post-pandemic shift, but in my mind, it's actually a post-technology combined with post-pandemic. So I think those changes we were going to see because of how the iPhone had come, how, you're carrying this thing in your back pocket, you're having it 24/7, right? So you're not seeing the effect right away, but you see it 5, 10 years down the road. So I think that's why it's so difficult. You'd have to really go back, see what technology, what these people were doing, really go down to figuring out what caused it. But I think overall, I think if you think about the brain, the nature nurture interaction and what we are wired for and what our environmental exposures are, it probably can explain that.
Do you think if it's technology that's leading to distractibility and lowering of IQ scores, do you think that with even if technology as a causal factor, the effects would be non-uniform?
Absolutely. I think we have to be careful here, right? We can never really say technology is causing it. I really think it's that
Yeah,
person media tool interaction that I think some people
yeah,
are more likely. But I think the problem really is so much of our data uses gets skewed because of the people on the extreme. So you have a few people, or what I always found is a lot of our findings were driven by a few people. The people at the extremes who use technology for a very long time. I haven't looked at the literature you looked at and how finely they looked at it. In the media literature, Walkenberg and her colleagues are doing person-centered analysis where they really find these person effects and not averages because averages are so susceptible to extremes. So
Yeah,
I think that's the devil is in the details a little bit, I think, with some of
true.
these large scale studies.
Yeah, especially I think in psychology, there's sort of this replication crisis as well, that what one group finds cannot be, and I'm sure we
Yeah.
have that in physics and biology and
Hmm.
all of these subjects as well. But certainly with psychology, where we
Hmm.
have so many interacting elements, there's been,
Exactly.
yeah, there's been trouble replicating studies. Speaking of studies, I noticed in your book
Hmm.
and in different studies that I looked up, it seems like there's the data in the US, there's trouble collecting data from in the US versus in China and Asia. What do you think is causing that?
Very simple, it's you know, I don't want to blame human consent. It's not IRB, but a lot of our research requires opting into studies versus opting out. Whereas in China, in Europe, it's passive consent. So people, if you don't want to take part in the study, then the parents have to say no. So I had a Belgian student, and I asked her, "How do you get these big sample studies?" And she said the schools are supposed to work with universities and collect data. Same with China, because I've collaborated with China. Here we have to go individually, get individual consent. One time I tried recruiting a group of high school students, went, made a presentation, gave them letters, gave them envelopes for them to sign up and send the consent form. I got one back out of I don't know how many hundreds I sent, and that was a blank form in an envelope.
Oh,
So it's finding people who will participate. That's really the
that's
challenge, I think.
we're actually on the last section of the
Okay.
podcast. And this is, I would say, probably, I don't know, even more open-ended and even more, probably, I don't know if you'll find it exciting. But so we saw this, the early 20th century as a good
Mhm,
time for physics, math, and then there were these revolutions in biology, and then there was a time for
mhm.
computer science to be a very good computer scientist. What's the situation with psychology? Was there a period that was a really good time to be a psychologist? And what is the field? What does progress in the field look like right now? Do you think it's slowing down, stagnating, or enhancing?
It's a really excellent question. I have wondered about that, right? I think across disciplines, we're not seeing those sort of big, significant sort of, earth-shattering changes, right, in how we are doing things. It's a little more incremental. I don't want to say something with a broad brush, right? But two things I've observed. In my own field, that is the area of technology, I feel we've gotten into somewhat of a stagnant place where we've become very descriptive. We're really not looking at causal underlying mechanisms. So some of it is, I keep reading, getting papers to review, but they're just documenting the same thing, maybe a different context, maybe they're testing one variable. It's somewhat feels repetitive. But I think in neuroscience, right, as once we started being able to do fMRI recording and whatnot, so much again became descriptive. So we may have hit a bit of a plateau. I don't know if again technology changed how we do research. We can all collect a lot of data quickly. I don't know again if it's the internet that's creating the challenges where people are not doing deep thought, reflective thought, right? I think some of the challenges is how academia changed and the pressure to publish. The bar keeps going up, right? Where before people could get tenure with 5, 6, 7 papers, now you do more, and the more you publish, the more frenetic pace you have. It's I don't know, but there is also the replicability crisis. I think there's this what do you say this bias towards presenting positive findings. Null findings don't get published. I
Yeah.
experienced that in my own research, and so you don't even know what are the findings that don't get published. So people are doing that two paper format, right, where you submit your study before you collect the data, and then you get it approved, and then once they say okay, do it, then they collect the data and they publish it regardless. Something happening. So I think we may have to really look at our discipline and do a better job of seeing how we do science. And then, of course, I'm sure you saw the case with Francesco Gino, the professor at Harvard, who's who was recently
Oh, yeah.
denied tenure because of a lot of falsification of data. So our entire science, it really depends upon researchers being ethical in how they do it. You can do p-hacking, you can selectively apply filters. So I don't know how much of it has also been because we have these advanced tools like, SEM modeling, HLM model, all these modeling techniques that, and, fast, high levels of analysis. But if used improperly by people and they don't report what their controls were, what their filters were, I don't know. I know that in the business school, in where they use a lot of archival data, where the data people go back to the same archival data and they can't replicate the findings because people have done very specific filters that
Yeah.
they're not reporting. So we may really need to go back and change how we teach research methods, how we incentivize our scientists, how we self-police ourselves, how we make the data available. So yeah, I don't know. It's a interesting question. I haven't thought about it in my discipline. I do think about, how, I also wonder if the incentives have changed. So people are being drawn to these professions for the wrong reasons. It used to be faculty didn't make a lot of money and you did it because you loved it. Now, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern I've heard even from physicists. If you had the ability to design an institution yourself, what sort of changes would you make to mitigate this problem?
Ah, I'm always thinking about things. This is not something that I've thought about, but if, on the fly, I would say really change how we teach, how we do research, really emphasize the ethical components of it, right? At the end of the day, it really depends on us being honest. If you looked at my book, there's a chapter about ethics. I really wonder sometime if the loss of religion and excessive use of technology has created these ethical challenges that people have. But really, also change incentives. Right now, we reward publications regardless of how well the research is. Maybe as a field start publishing, not have this bias towards only publishing positive
Yeah.
findings but also publish negative findings. But yeah, I think that may be, creating an institution that really emphasize quality. If you think about, I don't know if you're aware of UC Santa Cruz. I think when they created that model at the undergraduate level where the faculty gave detailed reports to the students about their strengths rather than grades. Something like that maybe at the faculty level. I don't know if this
Oh,
UC Santa Cruz is still doing it, but maybe something like that.
I think that's a great idea with this fast feedback. I think that would be a good idea. Okay, I have one last question before I let
Sure.
you go. So, as of now, what are you most excited about? It can be about psychology, about students, about anything. What are you most excited about?
How do we as educators, so I'm not so much as a researcher, right? In my administrative role, I really, have to think about pedagogy. What I'm most excited about is how can we leverage Gen AI and all these technological tools to help students become really good learners and be successful. So we're really experiencing a bit of a disengagement problem. So what I'm really excited about is how can we get that heady positive optimism about higher education and leveraging technology to help people become, infuse lifelong learning, passion for learning, infuse creativity and curiosity. That I think is what excites me at this point.